Yes, Bhavana, we can begin.
Yeah, am I audible, Manish?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Namaskar and very good morning to you all joining us from Delhi and various parts of India and the world for our very special and can surely assure you a very exciting international conference on Communist Party of China at 100, Global and Indian Perspectives. I am Bhavana Songaria-Dabhade, President of the Indian Futures. I take this opportunity to welcome you all today on behalf of the Indian Futures. I cannot but begin by hoping you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. Let me at the outset introduce the Indian Futures very briefly. We are a New Delhi-based independent think tank that started out our journey in January 2016 with the sole aim to create a global but India-centric platform to plainly and dispassionately discuss in the truest ancient Bharatiya tradition of a samvad, a dialogue. The idea of a new India. We at the Indian Futures seek to go beyond the headlines of the day and have an honest, deep conversation amongst the thinking community in India and abroad. We are extremely proud to have recently hosted some of India's finest minds from the world of government, politics, academia, diplomacy, and culture. Shri Suresh Prabhuji, former cabinet minister, Shri Devendra Fadnavis, former CM of Maharashtra, Shri V. Muralidharan, MOS of External Affairs, Shri Vinay Sahasrabuddhe President of ICCR, and Shri S. Gurumurthy ji, Shri Sunil Ambekar, and Shri J. Nandikumar, BJP General Secretaries, Shri B.L. Santosh, Shri Muralidharan Rao, Ms. Saroj Pandey, and Shri Ram Madhav ji, who joins us today to deliver the keynote address, and Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, Ambassador Kanwal Sibbal, and Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretaries of India, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Chairperson RIS, Professor C. Raja Mohan, and Professor Makarand Paranjpe are just a few I have named here. Other than top brains from different parts of the world, I would like to draw your attention to a very recent held international workshop on Quad in the Indo-Pacific, wherein top strategic minds from Australia, India, Japan, and US addressed the TIF. Before I hand over to Dr. Manish to introduce our very esteemed Shri Ram Madhav ji, I would like to request you to follow us on all social media such as FB, Twitter, Insta, and YouTube, and feel free to share today's event with hashtag TIF CPC 100. We would welcome that for sure. Kindly put yourself in mute mode too to avoid any distractions in the program. Thanks again to one and all who have joined us here and YouTube where we are already live streaming the event. Over to you, Dr. Manish now.
Thank you, Bhavana. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, namaskar and a good morning to all joining us here and on our YouTube channel where we are already live streaming, as Bhavana pointed out, this international conference. I'm very thrilled to have with us Shri Ram Madhav ji to deliver the conference's keynote address. He is surely one of the finest, sharpest, and peerless in the very challenging intellectual landscape of contemporary India. Ram Madhav ji is currently the member of the National Executive of the RSS and was till very recently the BJP General Secretary, and he is also the member of the Board of Governors of India Foundation. His prolific writings and speeches in top national and international media and academic institutions and organizations are always very insightful and very stimulating. In fact, he can be singularly credited to giving a very powerful intellectual ballast to the idea of New India in its various domestic and international avatars. It's truly an honor, sir, to have you with us today morning. We at the Indian Futures express our sincere gratitude for taking time out for the keynote address today. Before I turn the virtual floor to Ram Madhav ji, let me flag some key themes and key questions that bring us all here today in the first place. And these we would hope and we would like all the speakers to reflect on, which is the shifting geopolitical landscape and China's position and ambition therein. The CPC was founded on 1st July 1921, exactly 100 years ago, as China, the party state, and of course the civilization state, celebrates this historic centenary today. All significant and not so significant capitals around the world are having a serious look at what it means for them nationally and internationally. In a sense, both China and the world are what many would call the tipping point of sorts vis-a-vis each other. CPC and its narratives domestically and internationally. When I say internationally, it is about its geopolitical constructs. They form the starting point, a baseline to unpack the Chinese mind and behavior. Since 1914, especially when the PRC was formed, so the core, if I can point out, are two. First is that economics would trump ideology, and the second, which has been articulated by current President Xi Jinping, community with a shared future for mankind. Obviously, in earlier avatars, it was the peaceful rise, it was responsible stakeholder. So, two very important questions actually flow out of these. Number one, has the reality now bypassed these two narratives, these two central narratives? What about the weaponization of economic interdependence, which we are seeing now? What about the Chinese power juggernaut, which we are seeing through BRI, the debt trap diplomacy, wolf warrior diplomacy in East Asia, and obviously with India? So in East Asian India, definitely we see the maritime and the land border disputes. And let me just end by saying that, by pointing out and drawing your attention to Hoover Institution's just released new essay by Kai Shia. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing right, but a dissident and the former professor at Central Party School of the CPC. And the central argument worth noting and worth deeply reflecting is that the China's totalitarian regime is bent on internal suppression and external expansion. I think in that sense, we can go back to Henry Kissinger, who in early 60s wrote a classic text called The Necessity for Choice. And I think that is the juncture which India and which the globe and many significant world capitals have reached. What do we do about Chinese rise? What do we do about China's power? Enable or contain? I think these are the central questions. And I think we couldn't have really found or imagined a better person than Shri Ram Madhavji to speak on this very timely, very important, very stimulating sort of topic. So with this, I now invite Shri Ram Madhavji to deliver his keynote address. The floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you, Manish. My greetings and namaskars to all the participants. As has already been stated, today is the day when the Communist Party of China celebrates its centenary. July 1st was declared as the foundation day of the Communist Party of China by Mao Zedong in 1941. Although the historical records give July 23rd as the date of the inception of this party. The party was formed in 1921 at the residence of Mao Zedong in Shanghai. The residence was located in the French quarter of the city. 10-12 members got together. 2 of them came from Comintern, Communist International, formed by Lenin, subsequently pursued by Stalin. The meeting had to be abandoned because some unknown person barged into the room. He was suspected to be a spy of the Western power, so the meeting was immediately abandoned. Then all people dispersed. Then they got together on a boat in a lake, and it's a very fascinating story. Starting in 1921, the party has completed 100 years of successful run. Hardly is there any party in the world, barring a couple of parties in probably, in the history of countries like America, hardly is there any party which has had a continuous, functioning for 100 full years. Even in India, parties like Congress Party have split many times in between. The Congress Party of the independence movement was not the Congress Party post-independence. So many things happened. But in the Communist Party of China's case, it was a party that was started in 1921, and it continues to be the same party in 2021. Today, the CPC, the Communist Party of China, is a mammoth organization with 92 million members. And today, to secure the membership of the party is very difficult. Unlike parties in the rest of the country, they don't just take the mobile memberships. It's a very strict scrutiny that follows. Thousands apply, hundreds get the membership. It's a very premium thing to become a member of the Communist Party in China today. The party has today acquired enormous power. Today, the party, when it turned 100, is boasting that the party politics model that it has pursued in the last 100 years is a model for the entire world to emulate. So today, there is an effort to tell the world that, look, the Western democratic model has failed. So they try to highlight the race rights in America, the other problems elsewhere, the corruption in other countries, to from there to the failure of tackling COVID in many of the Western countries, and of course in countries like India. They try to highlight it and to showcase the Chinese example as a story of success of the Communist Party of China, thereby suggesting that efficiency of the one-party rule is better than inefficiency and chaos of the multi-party democracy. The effort today is to project Communist Party's 100-year experience as a great case for successful future functioning of the countries or political systems in the world. The CPC would have liked this celebration to be a major global event, but pandemic has thrown water over its ambition. It is now largely confined to China and its people. Nevertheless, it is an important opportunity for all of us to just try to understand this phenomena, which wants to be the model for the rest of the world today. What is that phenomena that we talk about, the phenomena called Communist Party of China? I briefly survey the 100-year history of China through just 2 parameters: 3 leaders, 6 sins. That is what is Communist Party of China all about in the last 100 years. It has had 3 towering leaderships in the last 100 years. The first leadership was that of Mao Zedong, who was the founder and supreme leader of the party. Although between 1921 and 1935, the first 14-15 years, the party had followed the principle of collective leadership. They had issues with Kuomintang. Then they subsequently developed problems with Stalin's USSR. In 1935, it was decided that we should discard this model of collective leadership. We should have what today we hear about Xi Jinping, the core leader. The concept of core leader was adopted by Communist Party of China in 1935, when Mao Zedong was declared as the core leader. And by core leader, what they meant was he would be the supreme leader of the political wing as well as the military wing of the party. He was the head of the army. He was head of the political establishment. By 40s, the Communist Party had built a strong army of 1 million soldiers. And you all know the history. 1949, they defeated Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and captured power in mainland China. Now, from there until 1976, until Mao had died, those 27 years, was the supreme control of China, of Mao, over the Communist Party of China. He was the supreme leader of the party and of the government and of the military. This was the model China had adopted right from the beginning. One core leader deciding everything, whether it is political leadership, or it is governance, or it is military. That model had worked until 1976. After 76, there was a small power struggle ensued for a couple of years. By 78, 79, Deng Xiaoping became the supreme leader of the party. Deng continued at the helm of affairs as the supreme leader, as the paramount leader, until his demise in 1997. So he was the second leader under whom the Communist Party of China had spent about 2 decades. His effort during the 2 decades period was to see if he could separate party and government. In fact, when Deng was at the helm of affairs, he appointed Hu Yaobang as the head of the party, Secretary General, and he appointed Zhao Jiang as the head of the government. Zhao Jiang was running the government, Hu Yaobang was running the party. 1986, Deng started talking emphatically about separating party and governance. And in 87, he actually got one resolution passed in the CPC's this 5-yearly conference that these two will function independent of each other. But then that effort did not last long. As soon as Deng died, Jiang Zemin, who was at the helm of affairs, again tried to return to Maoist model of creating supreme control of the party over both the government and the military, as well as on the party establishment. Jiang Zemin, followed by Hu Jintao, they tried to take this new model forward, but the third supreme leader came in the form of Xi Jinping in 2012. Xi Jinping came with a determination to return to the Maoist era politics. He, in the last 1 decade, has clearly restored the supremacy of the party. In 2017, in the 19th Party Congress, he got the party constitution amended to declare that everything, whether it is government or military or the education or the schools or the offices, everything will be guided and controlled by the party. So by 2017 or by 2021, as we talk today about the completion of 100 years of the party is today back in full control of the Chinese society. It today controls the politics, it today controls the government, and remember, it today controls the minds and thinking of the Chinese people. It has effectively used technology as an important tool to gain absolute control over the entire Chinese nation and society. Today, China is synonymous with the Communist Party of China. These 3 leaders are important for us to understand the progression of Communist Party of China in that country. But I will highlight 6 important episodes in this journey, which give you an idea about what kind of a party we are talking about. First was during Mao's era, the effort to purge the intelligentsia. It began in mid-50s. In fact, very deceptively, Mao had given a call for the Communist Party leadership to come forward with their suggestions for governance, or for the future of the party, rather, I would say. Many innocently came forward with lots of ideas. By 56, 57, Mao had very carefully collected information about which leader thinks which way. And he found a lot of intellectuals who were wanting openness, who were in favor of greater freedoms. He found in all of them enemies of the communist ideology. He started major purging of intelligentsia during that period of 56, 57, and 58. That was the period when Mao had introduced collectivization in China. The agricultural collectives were formed in the entire country. These intellectuals who were wanting better reform in the country were all condemned to villages to work in agricultural farms. The collectivization process began. That was when the first purge within the Communist Party had happened. Remember, purge word, because purge is an integral part of the history of Communist Party. The first purge was the first sin or first negative episode of Communist Party 1950s. Second incident was the way Tibet was captured. It's another important reminder that Communist Party has a peculiar way of dealing with different communities or different parts of their society. Tibet in 1959 witnessed one of the most brutal oppressions in history. Today, people talk about Xinjiang. The earliest version of Xinjiang was Tibet in 50s, and most importantly, the great suppression that happened in March 1959 in Lhasa and other areas of Tibet. Thousands of Tibetans were killed, temples destroyed, nuns raped, so many atrocities were committed, giving a taste of Communist Party's brutal behavior when it comes to minority communities. 1959, suppression and occupation of Tibet, which had finally forced the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, to flee to India, was the second most atrocious, sinful, episode of the Communist Party of China. The third sinful episode was also during Mao era. That was 1966-76, the so-called Cultural Revolution. Another major period of purging happened during Cultural Revolution. Whoever was seen as a challenge to Mao was branded as a bourgeois, as an enemy of socialism, as an enemy of Communist Party, and they were purged. In the name of Cultural Revolution, massive atrocities were committed. That phase of 66-76 was the third period of sinful atrocities of the Communist Party of China. As I mentioned, Deng took over in 1978. Deng introduced major reforms. In fact, 1981 Party Congress was an important milestone in Communist Party's history, where it was, today they are celebrating 100 years. In 1981, the party had celebrated 60 years of its existence. But that time it was Deng who was at the helm of affairs. Deng had introduced major reforms for openness, etc. But when Tiananmen Square happened, the hardliners prevailed upon Deng to return to hardline approach to dealing with freedoms, whether it is freedom of expression or political freedoms and all. The atrocities perpetrated in 1989 at Tiananmen Square under the gauge of Deng Xiaoping were not only a very negative blemish on Deng's own history, but also another reminder that Communist Party had not given up its character of oppression and suppression of those whom they found as dissidents or those whom they found as bourgeois freedom fighters. The fourth episode, the fifth episode of Communist Party's real character came out when Xi Jinping took over in 2012. One of the things he initiated was, he held the party's Politburo meeting. He saw 22 leaders in front of him. He found in them 70% to be potential challenges for him in future. So he immediately introduced this idea of purging the party of the so-called corrupt and revisionist elements. By revisionist, he said those who are influenced by the Western ideas. By corrupt, of course, he meant not only petty corruption, but the political corruption. In the name of anti-corruption, in the name of anti-revisionism, Xi Jinping has again returned to Maoist era, purging of the dissident voices in the party. You have heard about Bo Xilai. Where is he? Nobody knows. He has been languishing in jail for the last 10 years, and nobody knows what is the reason. Because in Chongqing, where Bo Xilai was the party secretary, in the election, Chongqing chose Bo Xilai over Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping, as soon as he became the president, immediately purged Bo Xilai. The purging started by Mao has returned in China with the return of Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping has brought back Maoist era purging, number one. Number two, Xi Jinping's whole approach to Xinjiang problem is a classic case of what would happen if the Communist Party returns with full might, full force. The Communist Party cadres, they are today back in power thanks to Xi Jinping, and it is they who picked up 1 million of the Uyghurs today, the people, Muslim Turkish origin people of Xinjiang, and put them in concentration camps in a most cruel way, in a most brutal way. The return of the Communist Party under Xi Jinping in full force is a return to Maoist era politics, and these two latest sins of Xi's purging and Xi's handling of Xinjiang are again a stark reminder of the character and the approach of Communist Party of China. Let me just end by saying one thing here. Today, Communist Party assumes that it is the most powerful political entity in the world. Party political model of Communist Party, as per Communist Party leadership, is going to be the future model for all the countries to emulate. But remember, when it returns, this kind of politics is what going to return. One party rule was known to USSR until 1991. It lived in USSR for 73, 74 years. It survived there. It is surviving in another country called North Korea. The one party rule is continuing there also for more than 6 decades. And the third country where one party rule has successfully completed 72 years is China. And that one party rule is the most threatening thing for any democratic setup. And the last point that I wanted to make is, far from being a model to the rest of the world today, Communist Party of China is the most hated party in the entire world. Pew Research Foundation has said that 80% people in the democratic world hate Chinese present system. The Chinese Communist Party probably understands this. The last word is, all this is okay. All this power projection, all this pretense of supremacy, super control is okay. But underneath all this, there is continuous fear, insecurity within the ranks of Communist Party. Especially most insecure person in China today is none other than Xi Jinping. If you read his, the Xi Jinping thought has come out in 3 volumes already. If you read his volumes, in each volume, you find a number of references to the collapse of Soviet Union. He keeps on harping. You see, if you go freedoms, what will happen? Look at Soviet Union, Glasnost, what has it done to Russia? So be careful. See, Russia, Soviet Union is touted as an example, as a bad example all the time, to tell Chinese people and Chinese Communist Party that don't entertain any freedom, because the day you entertain freedoms, you will become like the Communist Party of Soviet Russia, you will collapse. So perpetual fear and perpetual insecurity is what today marks the centenary of the Communist Party leadership. That also we must remember. I thank Manish and his team for giving me this opportunity. It's a very long story, but I tried to put it in about 20-22 minutes in a short period. Thank you very much and namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I think this was really an exercise of sheer brilliance, ideational structure, and precision. And I think that was a fantastic keynote address. You started out brilliantly, talking how success, in fact, looking at the past 100 years, you rightly pointed out how successful run of CPC it has been, of really a mammoth organization, and again, with enormous power. And two very important points, I think, which are so original, is that while China is seen as a model for the world because of its efficiency, that is one which many have to contend with. And the last point, obviously, the perils of one party rule. And I think the lessons for the world at large, that now you see ultimately fear and insecurity driving Xi Jinping's maybe internal and external policies. But sir, you beautifully pointed out how, and I think that prism was really brilliant, that three ideas, three people, three leaders, and 6 episodes, I think that beautifully captured the entire journey of the CPC. So I mean, this was brilliant. Thank you again for really, I mean, enlightening us with this very stimulating talk. And I'm sure all the participants, including the speakers, distinguished speakers, would really take cues from this and expand more and reflect more on these ideas which you have laid out for us today. So thank you, sir. Truly an honor to have you with us, and have a safe stay. Thank you. Namaskar. With this, we move to the first working session, and we already have with us Ambassador Shyam Saran. So can you please, Prof, bring Ambassador Saran before us? And Ambassador Shyam Saran is, everyone knows, is an Indian career diplomat. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in '70 and rose to become the Foreign Secretary to the Government of India. Prior to his appointment as Foreign Secretary, he was very importantly India's ambassador to Myanmar, Indonesia, Nepal, High Commissioner to Mauritius. After, in fact, completion of the Foreign Secretary's tenure as a Foreign Secretary, he was appointed Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Indo-US civil nuclear issues, and later as Special Envoy and Chief Negotiator. He himself is an author of a very brilliant book which was released recently, a couple of years ago, and I still remember the stellar role which he played in the Indo-US nuclear deal, and in fact that really brought India out of the closet in many ways. Internationally, it was really an international set of sorts. So without further ado, I invite Ambassador Shyam Saran to address us. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Manish, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this very important session marking the 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party. I would like to compliment Mr. MADHAV for giving us a kind of a very broad canvas about the history of the Chinese Communist Party and some of the critical landmarks in that history. And what we can expect for the future. What I will try and do here is, since this session is devoted more to the geopolitical aspect, I will try and link this anniversary and what it means with respect to the international geopolitical landscape. So if I speak for about 15 minutes, is that okay? Okay. So I want to pick up on what Shri Ram Madhav ji spoke about, the negative lesson that China's Communist Party draws from the experience of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So in many of the writings of Xi Jinping and some of his speeches which have not been publicized, these are remarks that he has made in some of the inner party meetings, and some of this which has now come out. 2 or 3 things. One, he says he was asked by President Bush not President Bush, sorry, President Obama, as to what keeps him awake at night. And he said that, the fear that another Gorbachev may this time appear in China. That is, something that he mentioned as being a great anxiety that the party has. The second point that he made is that one of the reasons why the Soviet Communist Party collapsed was because of the ideological sort of underpinning of the party had been allowed to, in a sense, diminish and then almost evaporate. And he, again, not only blamed Gorbachev, but also said that this had happened over a period of time, that the ideological commitment of the party members to the communist ideology, that had become very weak. So when the crisis came, when a challenge came, they were not able to draw upon that pool of ideological commitment in order to resist the kind of threat that the party was facing. So that is the second element. The third element that he mentioned was that one of the very critical reasons why this overthrow of the Soviet Communist Party could not be resisted was also because the party had lost control over the armed forces. That is, the armed forces had been sort of made to become entirely professional with very little political, consciousness. And that the party's control over and the party's leadership over the armed forces, that leadership had diminished. So again, when the threat came to the party, the armed forces, in a sense, stayed on the sidelines. They did not act to safeguard and protect the party. So he says that these are the three important lessons that he draws. That number one, leadership is critical. And that leadership must be, of course, very much committed to communism and the communist ideology. Second is that it is extremely important for a communist party never to, in fact, let go on the ideological aspect. That ideological education of its cadres, ideological commitment of its cadres is absolutely fundamental to the survival of a communist party. And the third important element is that the Communist Party must have control over the gun, that is, over the armed forces. So the armed forces should be looked upon as an arm of, as a guardian of the party, and not something which is what it had become over last several years as a professional national army. That is, the PLA is not just the army of China, it is more importantly the army of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you look at the last several years, that is about 9 years since the rule of Xi Jinping, you will see the playing out of these three elements. Leadership is very important. So what Deng Xiaoping had said should be collective leadership, that has to be jettisoned, because leadership and centralized leadership is fundamental to the survival of the party. Therefore, the political logic behind Xi Jinping emerging as the leader at the core of being the symbol of this centralized leadership of the party, this is something very much in line with that theory of leadership as far as communism is concerned. The second important element is the ideological underpinning. And there, what is very interesting is that something which was actually resorted to by his, rival, who ultimately was purged, as Ram Madhavji pointed out, Posi Lai, who was the party secretary in the town of Chongqing. He is the one who actually pioneered the revival of Maoism in terms of, the songs of the revolution, singing some of the old songs from the even the Cultural Revolution days, which caused a lot of anxiety. So this is something which, you see Xi Jinping also adopting, that is ideology becomes a very important element. So again, over the last few years, you will see that the ideological education part has become very critical. And people have to, in Chinese, they say, biao tai, that is, you must show what your stand is. Self-criticism, education sessions, these have become extremely important. The third element and very critical element is the control over the armed forces. And this is, again, you see that Xi Jinping has, in fact, over the last several years, consolidated his control over the armed forces. Some of the purges took place of the top military leadership as well. And he has worked very hard, in fact, to ensure that the armed forces are an arm of the party and not just a national army. So these three elements we need to understand. Now, these coming together at the 100th anniversary, I think these are being put forward as the guarantee that while the party has survived for 100 years, this is a guarantee also that the party will continue to flourish, will continue to survive. So this, I think, are themes which you will find in the celebration of the anniversary. The other element is, of course, what does this mean for the rest of the world? Now, the difference today is that in the past, because China is a socialist state, the Soviet Union as a socialist state, these were still, in a sense, isolated or islands in what was an international landscape of essentially non-communist states. So the projection at that time was we should be left to do what we want to do. Every country should have the right to determine its own social and economic system. Peaceful coexistence, for example, that different kind of social systems should be allowed to exist side by side. Now, the difference is now that since the global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008, when it became almost clear that the capitalist system had a crisis right at its heart, and China came out of that crisis, in fact, perhaps with its economy recovering much faster than the other capitalist economies. So from that time onwards, China has been saying, really the model for other countries to follow is what China represents, a kind of an authoritarian centralized leadership of a essentially capitalist system, a market-based system, not capitalist in that sense, but state capitalist. But very clearly, the effort is to try and project that while the traditional capitalist societies across the world, including the superpower, which is the United States, have really failed their people, have not been able to come up with an answer to the economic and social crisis which they face. It is China with its very strong, disciplined kind of society, which has actually been able to do that. And that has been reinforced despite the initial sort of problems that the Chinese encountered, and Xi Jinping himself was under pressure during the early days of the pandemic. Very quickly they recovered, and using the very authoritarian kind of a system that they possess, they did. There is no doubt about it that they were able to achieve, total control over this pandemic. So that also has been presented to the rest of the world as the superiority of the system which China represents. So when you are looking at geopolitics, the difference today is that China is holding itself up as a kind of an example to the rest of the world. So it's no longer merely that we should be allowed to coexist or we should be allowed to, practice our own system, but now it is that the system that we practice is actually an example to the rest of the world. And the appeal of this is particularly amongst the developing countries. The appeal is particularly amongst even countries which may be somewhat democratic, but there is a tendency to centralized leadership. There is a tendency towards authoritarianism, which we see across the world today. You see, an upsurge of nationalism. You see the kind of a hunger for strong leaders who can fix the various crises that countries across the world are facing. So in that context, putting forward this model is become a very important feature of China's foreign policy. Of course, I will end with just making the point that throughout the history of the Chinese Communist Party, one of the chief ingredients of its success has been its ability to link its own interests with that of the national interest, nationalism. So communism succeeded in China not because of communism, but it was seen as a nationalist force. And that nationalist dimension is very much part and parcel of how the Chinese Communist Party projects itself. So the whole aspect of China's rejuvenation, China recapturing the central position that it had in the international geopolitical landscape, this is something which is today, as you can see, very much part and parcel of the way China projects itself, whether it is through wolf warrior diplomacy, which is the more aggressive aspect, but also through much more benign aspect, like, for example, offering assistance and offering like under the Belt and Road initiative, offering infrastructure development to developing countries. It is important to remember that there is a very strong connection with the nationalism aspect, and therefore the anniversary becomes part and parcel of that exercise of projecting China as having become one of the great nations of the world again. And so this is party anniversary. Don't forget that this is a lead up to 2049, which is 100 years of the People's Republic of China. So during the next several years, these themes of China's rejuvenation, the themes of having pioneered a different kind of an economic strategy, much more in keeping with the requirements of other developing countries. These are themes which are going to become very important. And of course, this will be a very large and enduring challenge for India. And how we respond to this is, of course, will also determine not only India's place in Asia and the world, but will also, in a sense, determine the fate of Asia itself. Is it going to be a China-centric Asia, or is it going to be a much more multipolar Asia? That is, something which is on the table, as it were. And also, what is going to be the fate of democracy? Because there is pessimism about democracy. There is pessimism about democracy's ability to deliver the welfare of people. And how India, as the world's largest democracy, is able to meet its economic and social challenges, able to deliver welfare to its own people. This is also going to be a very important factor in determining what is going to be the shape of Asia in the years to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. I think that was again a very brilliant address, as usual. You pointed out, and again, I'll just fast forward because we're running out of time. That the very important point I think you mentioned was about how the control of the armed forces, the PL is it's so much important to the CPC, and that's a very important point which we all need to understand. And also the larger, bigger point, how the CPC in its 100-year history has developed a very innate ability to look at its own interest and portray it and narrate it as Chinese nationalism, as Chinese interest. I think that's a wonderful point. And again, we should be looking towards 2049 when China would be celebrating 100 years of PRC. And a very important fundamental point, which in fact Ram Madhavji is also with us, also pointed out about this Chinese model and how it is so important that what is at stake is really democracy and democracy's ability to deliver for its peoples. I think for its citizens. I think that's a very important point. So thank you, sir, for this brilliant address. With this, I invite Ambassador Preeti Saran, who is with us. And Ambassador Preeti Saran joined the Foreign Service in way back in '82. She has served in Indian missions of Moscow, Dhaka, Cairo, Geneva, Toronto, Vietnam. She was obviously secretary, very importantly, Indian ambassador to Vietnam, a very significant diplomatic assignment. She served as the secretary East in the MEA, and obviously now she is also a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us and for really agreeing to speak with us. It's truly an honor to have you with us. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Manish. Good morning. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Okay. So thank you for including me in this very interesting and a very important event. You asked me to comment upon, in the context of the Communist Party's 100 years, to give you the Southeast Asian perspective. And so I'll restrict my comments to this particular area. Taking off from what Mr. Madhavji and Mr. Shyam Saran mentioned about Chinese aggression and how it's going to posture itself for the next few decades. Clearly, Southeast Asia becomes one area where definitely China is, of course, globally as well, but definitely attempting a new regional architecture using its economic heft, its political influence and military power to integrate the countries of this region into its fold. Today, China is the most important investor, the largest trading partner, and it has replaced USA as the dominant economic power in the region. China is also actively promoting partnerships in traditional and non-traditional security, a space that it was not there before in law enforcement, and of course, trade, commerce, infrastructure development, the Belt Road Initiative, etc. During COVID, China remained the biggest supplier of medical equipment, of experts and vaccines in most ASEAN countries, often under media fanfare, to be perceived as the one that provided maximum assistance. 30 million strong Chinese diaspora in the entire region also remain a very important asset for China. That said, China's growing power and influence also generates deep anxieties, even as its economic growth presents opportunities. Whether China will become the overall dominant power will, of course, depend upon the countries in the region, especially if they willfully cede their traditional strategic space to a Chinese-dominated regional order, both in security and in economic growth. There is concern because of China's territorial disputes with its neighbors, its militarization of the South China Sea, and the potential for military conflict. This anxiety is strongest in Philippines and Vietnam, and with both, China has overlapping maritime claims, as it does with Malaysia and Brunei as well. China has used salami slicing tactics to divide the ASEAN countries on their territorial claims in South China Sea, and has enmeshed them into an endless cycle of meaningless negotiations on a code of conduct. Chinese dam building activities in the Mekong River, with its adverse impact on environment, on water availability, and agricultural production in the lower riparian countries of Mekong, is another reason for concern. But so far, the ASEAN countries, the affected ones, have not allowed these disputes to affect other parts of their relationship with China. Much will depend upon their collective ability to deal with Chinese insidious behavior. The potential impact on regional stability due to US-China rivalry is an even bigger issue for these smaller countries, as no country within the ASEAN framework would wish to make a choice or side with one against the other. Ideally, their preference would be to balance the two in a dynamic equilibrium. Perceptions vary within ASEAN countries on potential Chinese threat. There are some that completely toe the Chinese line, like Laos and Cambodia, while there are others who hesitate to hedge against China. And then there are countries like Vietnam and Singapore that actively do so. The China story is much more nuanced if you look at each country individually. As I mentioned, Cambodia and Laos are, of course, the closest allies of China within ASEAN. They have robust economic, military, educational, and cultural relations, and a deep penetration of the Belt Road Initiative. Both downplay the South China Sea issue in the ASEAN forums, which helps Chinese cause. And yet, in Cambodia, in spite of the leadership and the establishment's very strong support of China, there is a very strong negative perception about China in public opinion, and often anti-establishment sentiments in Cambodia manifest itself in anti-China demonstrations. These sentiments are less so in Laos, but then Laos has actually ceded a lot of its suzerainty, if I might use that expression, to China, particularly in the areas bordering China. And they completely subscribe to Chinese concept of a community of shared future. But Chinese patronage of Laos and Cambodia encroaches upon Vietnam's traditional sphere of influence, tactics which we are familiar with here in our Indian subcontinent. And then the China-Vietnam tensions often cause discomfort for the smaller countries of the erstwhile Indochina. Amongst the other traditional allies of USA, for example, Thailand, it is no longer USA's key partner for advancing USA's interests in the region vis-a-vis China. China and problems relating to the Mekong River, Thailand continues to seek Chinese markets, Chinese tourism, and assistance in securing 5G technology, etc. Philippines, which was once again a close partner and ally of USA, and which has a direct territorial dispute with China, is today very wary of its expansive activities in South China Sea. And yet, during Duterte's presidency, it rejected the Permanent Court of Arbitration's very favorable ruling on South China Sea. It terminated the Visiting Forces Agreement with US in 2020 and moved closer to China. However, in the course of this last 1 year, more recently, we see that it is faced with increased Chinese aggression and therefore is attempting some rebalancing. But fear of China's punitive economic sanctions and a conviction that the tribunal ruling cannot be enforced motivates Philippines to remain pragmatic and not take on China headlong. Indonesia, which is actually the biggest country in the ASEAN region, has a strategic partnership both with USA and China, but it has moved closer to China than ever before, especially post-COVID when China offered financial and health-related assistance. Meanwhile, Indonesia's trade with USA has stagnated, and to quote, it has become more unpopular than popular, whereas China has become the most impactful country for them. It is the second largest source of foreign direct investment. The total Indonesian, 1/3 of its imports come from China, about 70% of the export to China. Although tensions prevail over illegal Chinese fishing of its boats and fishermen trespassing Indonesian waters, I think the economic imperatives trump other considerations. And of course, US neglect of Indonesia is also a contributing factor in Indonesia reciprocating Chinese overtures. Malaysia, another large country, has avoided confrontation in spite of having a maritime dispute with China, but has deepened its economic relations, welcomed Huawei's 5G network, chosen not to comment on the Uyghur Muslims' predicament. China remains the largest source of FDI for Malaysia, has considerable amount of trade with them, and prefers to accommodate China instead of confronting them. Myanmar, our immediate neighbor, of course, is another country where China has a very strong presence in terms of trade, aid, investment, and infrastructure, particularly using the Belt Road Initiative of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. China is developing ports, railways, their hydropower projects, and certainly provides China a very critical pathway to the Bay of Bengal. And yet, Myanmar retains a very deep distrust of China. But unfortunately, powers focus too much on human rights and democracy. It restricts Myanmar's ability to hedge against China in spite of its distrust of China. And certainly the new sanctions against Myanmar in February this year will further limit its maneuvering for the current regime. Brunei is another very friendly country from China's perspective. It gets Chinese investment in infrastructure, oil, refinery, telecommunications, aquaculture, and has chosen, in fact, to separately reach some consensus with China on its overlapping territorial claims. Very much a Chinese tactic of, dividing and ruling and settling it separately bilaterally with each of them rather than allowing them to do so collectively. Amongst those who hedge more aggressively with China, will not take them on head on, however, is of course Singapore, which explicitly tries to navigate between USA and China, but does not want to choose and considers US a resident power with vital interests in the region, while it also considers China a reality at its doorstep. Singapore resented US withdrawal from TPP and therefore was extremely keen that India be part of the RCEP as well. It remains committed to BRI, it has huge investments in China, and would like to retain its voice. But at all times, Singapore remains conscious of potential Chinese punitive action and the damage that it can inflict upon Singapore. Vietnam, though it is a single party system, a communist party like China, and in fact, the Vietnamese Communist Party was born in China, it has, however, a very long and a complicated history characterized by distrust and fundamental difference and a very strong anti-Chinese public opinion. But it has very dexterously used camaraderie and brotherly relations between the two communist parties to manage its relations with China. Vietnam chooses to compartmentalize its maritime dispute and yet has cooperative relations on economy and infrastructure. However, Vietnam has not allowed Huawei 5G and developed its own network. And if I'm not incorrect, perhaps it's also not allowed Chinese vaccines so far. It is regarded the main troublemaker for China in the region. It has therefore improved its relations with USA, Japan, with USA where it had a history of its war years, etc. But in spite of it, with Japan, with Australia, and of course India. Given its proximity to China and its vulnerabilities, however, Vietnam should not be and will not make a choice between China and the others. So if you were to look at it collectively, in conclusion, I would say the Southeast Asia's growing economic dependence upon China does not mean that the countries are unaware of Chinese threat, of its regional ambitions and its hegemonic behavior. But as China may wish to exclude USA and others from the region, there remains a deep mistrust of Chinese policies and motivations, although to varying degrees in different countries and at different times. This impacts domestic public opinion. Increasing burden of Chinese debt also weighs heavily on several countries, particularly the smaller ones like Laos. On security, barring a few exceptions, the ASEAN countries will not put all its choices on China, and if asked to choose, unlikely to choose China. The region will continue to hedge as optimal strategy and will work to retain ASEAN centrality and independent decision-making ability. And this is where increased presence of USA, of Japan, of EU countries, of Australia, India, and even Russia would be welcome for them. Now, finally, where does India fit into this? Certainly, we cannot match Chinese economic influence, but we do offer an opportunity for diversification, which should be explored and implemented much more vigorously under our ACTIS program. Post-COVID provides new opportunities to look at some sectors afresh, particularly health, education, fintech, cybersecurity, new supply chains, and infrastructure building. And when I talk of infrastructure, actually, I'm not looking at it as just one directional, where we can invite Southeast Asian countries to participate in India's infrastructure building. There is a lot that we can learn and emulate from their successes. India's non-threatening presence, its excellent bilateral relations with each of the 10 countries, and its regional cooperation within the ASEAN framework strengthens ASEAN's unity and centrality. India contributes to creating a multipolar region that reins in China's belligerence. India's soft power, whether you use Buddhism or yoga or performing arts, our television programs, our cinema, the Indian diaspora's presence there, a very positive one. Even our very exemplary capacity building programs, which have earned us immense goodwill in so many of the countries in Southeast Asia. These should not be underestimated and in fact used to its full potential. India, in many ways, counterbalances Chinese threats in ways that other powers cannot and do not. And India should play to these strengths, continue to build active partnerships, both within Southeast Asia and beyond, to sustain that inclusivity, to retain that balance within the region. So I'll stop here and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran, for giving us a very comprehensive country after country perspective on the CPC, obviously, but the CPC, the Chinese presence in Southeast Asia, the American presence, and how they are in a way in competition. Obviously, many are not looking for a choice between the US and China, but I think to what extent that moment has gone, at some stage the Southeast Asian countries would have to make a choice in some way. So thank you for that very I think it was really a broad-based, giving us a very clear picture about how US and China are stacked vis-a-vis each other in Southeast Asia. Thank you, Ambassador. With this, I invite Professor Swaran Singh to address us. Professor Singh is the president of Association of Asia Scholars and chairperson and my senior colleague in CIPOD SIS. In fact, he is one of the very few India's, top sinologists. And in fact, whenever I switch on TV news, he is there. Whenever I switch on YouTube, he is there. Facebook, he is there, speaking on China. So it's an absolute delight to have you with us, sir, to speak on. And in fact, he should, ideally, he should have begun today's proceedings talking about the Chinese dream and its various, especially the international components. With this, the floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you, Manish and Bhavana, and to your team of TIF for organizing today's discussion on 100 years of Chinese Communist Party. I'm delighted to be part of such a stellar list of speakers that you have arranged for today's discussion on this very topical subject. We all heard Shri MADHAV beautifully summarize 100 years in terms of 3 leaders and 6 sins or 6 episodes of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm sure he could have spoken much longer, because now 3 leaders are being even described in terms of 2+1, because Xi Jinping is actually being seen much closer to Mao Zedong. And clearly people are saying that his tenure may not end after 10 years as the convention is, but maybe go up to 2032 and beyond, and maybe he stays at the helm till he breathes last. Of course, several question marks on that will remain all the time. And then, of course, Secretary Shyam Saran also beautifully underlined how China would like to project itself as a successful model in many ways, despite all the limitations, and how it has become lately kind of a more desirable thing to have authoritarian leaders, and how a certain pessimism about democracy is there, and how China is also kind of giving out to several countries turnkey projects in terms of infrastructure building under BRI. Ambassador Preeti Saran also underlined a very interesting drift, as if how each of these Southeast Asian countries look at China, either in terms of towing the Chinese line, as she mentioned about Laos, Cambodia, or some other countries hedging, or some other countries looking at in terms of more nuanced relationship, but fundamentally underlining how about 63 years ago, ASEAN, that was created to contain spread of communism, and in Asia, China was the concern. And now in 1960s, all of these countries were paranoid about China supporting communist parties or sometimes even outfits in their own countries, are now increasingly being cultivated by Beijing, and how ASEAN appears to be gradually drifting. And if I'm kind of pushing my neck out a little bit, drifting away from United States to China in that sense. But if we look at 100 years celebrations And I noticed that Shri MADHAV mentioned China would have wanted it to become a global event. But because of pandemic, it has been largely restricted to China, primarily to Beijing. All of you must have seen pictures or clips of various celebrations happening there. Fundamentally, what we notice here is that there is some omissions which are already covered, which are not part of the narrative today. And more important is this final exit of China. And I always say China is a unique case where party owns the nation. So it's a final exit of the party from its very long century-old narrative, national narrative of century of humiliation, to now the next narrative, which is guiding their domestic foreign policies, is rejuvenation of the nation, which is how the China dream is often described. And because China dream is being now presented in terms of specific targets, not just the two centennial goals of the party's 100 years now in 2021 and Republic of China's, Chinese People's Republic of China's 100 years in 2049, but also another major target of 2035, where Xi Jinping wants to create PLA as world standard forces which not only fight but also win wars. So very specific targets being given one after another. And in that sense, it's not only the Chinese dream which is giving us an outline of what China wants to be at what part of the coming years, but also underlining how that Chinese dream in that sense is going to be primarily a roadmap of how China is going to emerge. And that has clearly implications for the entire region, definitely, but even for the outside world in that sense, because it is seeking to transform not just China itself, but also transform using that model as they believe, or the Chinese roadmap in terms of China dream, to also transform the rest of the world in that sense. And the way Chinese dream has been interpreted within China and also outside China. For example, one of the most famous books by Liu Mingfu is called China Dream, published in 2015. And he himself talked about coming century being, seeing a duel of the century between United States and China. And he believes that China will ultimately be taking the place of United States in the world order. This was in 2015, 2017. Another famous book came from Graham Allison, who talks about Destined for War, but puts an interesting subtitle to say, can American and Chinese escape Thucydides' trap in that sense? So there's a possibility of finding an alternative solution rather than there is a direct confrontation between the two leaders. Now, Xi Jinping has clearly, repeatedly underlined his vision of China Dream, whether it was soon after taking over as party secretary 10 years ago in November of 2012, when he was first time addressing an exhibition called Road to Revival, the National Museum exhibition, where he used this expression for the first time and defined it as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Indeed, when he took over president in March of 2013, on 17th March, he addressed the nation, used China Dream repeatedly, again, and goading citizens of China, individuals, to give their best. So the language has shifted now from individuals expected of making sacrifices to now individuals making efforts. So it's a positive spin in that debate in that sense. So repeatedly, this China Dream seems to be the one which is going to be China's roadmap as to how it wants to develop itself. And it sees that China's development would have implications for the rest of the world. Some people from outside look at it in terms of China using this roadmap to seek centrality in global affairs. So global governance has become a major issue in Chinese narratives, for example, but outside experts also now talk about Pax Seneca in that sense. So we also see that increasingly now there are comparisons being made, and then sort of resemblance is very clear here of the so-called American dream and the Chinese dream, and in that sense, how these two dreams, in that sense, are going to define how the future unfolds itself in terms of their contestation for global leadership, leading the world in one or the other direction. And let me underline at least three fundamental dichotomies or contrasts that we notice in these two dreams as to what kind of model United States and China wants to present to the world. And either of them would really influence a great deal as to how the world lives in coming decades. So first of all, for example, American dream is very focused on the liberal tradition of individual, and it fundamentally focuses on individuals' life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as you know. And it only seeks state to make conveniences, make facilitation, so that individuals can then seek to achieve what they want to achieve. In fact, if you remember that the Declaration of Independence of America goes to the extent of saying that if any government comes and becomes obstruction to this life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, then of course such a government actually should be thrown. And he says people would have right to alter or abolish such a government. Now compare it with Xi Jinping's China dream, where he's looking at individuals to keep making collective efforts, as much as possible to see the great rejuvenation of the nation. And you remember I said China is a unique case where party owns the nation. So it's fundamentally rejuvenation of the party which is being expected at end of such an exercise. So it's a kind of contrast here. Second very significant thing is that in China, for a long time, I remember the phrases that come out of leaders' speeches, one belt, one road, or now Belt and Road Initiative. In Chinese, of course, they still call it one belt, one road. And I used to ask several friends there, colleagues and experts, as to why this name one belt, one road. And not many people had a clear understanding, but this had become a slogan. So likewise now, China Dream, the only source of what it means is Xi Jinping and his speeches. And the 3 volumes that Ambassador Shyam Saran mentioned that have come out of the speeches of Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping is the sole source of what China Dream is meant to be. Whereas American Dream is exactly opposite. It has no singular source. It has multiple sources, and it has kind of sometimes contrasting sources. For example, it actually talks of individual success stories. So you could talk about stories of George Washington, Henry Ford, Michael Jackson, all the way up to Elon Musk, who have transformed way of life in the United States and to a great extent transformed way of life around the world. So these are again very varying, differing, and all kind of different sources of what becomes a celebration or a model of what would define American dream. Xi Jinping on the other side is trying to strengthen state, which means again party owns the state, party owns the military, party owns even people, because increasingly society, Xi Jinping's effort has been bringing closer the society, military and administration to the party. So party would define each of these. So in that sense, strengthening of state would perhaps actually end up stifling imaginations of American dream in that sense. So how contrasting they again become. Third, and I think most important point, which also makes it very, very uncertain as to how the Chinese dream will be unfolding over a period of time, is that there are very often pursuits which are seen as part of China dream, which seeks to be pushing people in opposite directions. There is enormous sort of quest or strive for material modernization. Material life of China has revolutionized over a period of time in that sense. But at the same time, constant reinforcement of reverence of classical traditions, classical poetry, filial values, Confucius edicts, which may be also felt partly because there has been enormous stress on family values and social values because of this rapid transformation of 40 years in China. So there is a kind of pull and push in opposite directions. Even military thinking, for example, military doctrines, strategies, on the one side, they're talking of military modernization. By 2035, they want to complete the military modernization and make it a world-class armed forces. But on the other side, they keep talking about Confucius edicts, Sun Tzu becoming much more an inspiration. So looking for wisdom in ancient scriptures in that sense, while competing with extremely modern and far more varying competitors like the United States is. So in that sense, again, the other example could be how party keeps claiming all the credit for itself for poverty alleviation. For example, Chinese are a model for 800 million people being brought out of poverty in last 40 years. And in 2020, they claim that extreme poverty has come to an end. The last poor man under poverty, kind of below the poverty line, has been brought up, brought out of poverty. But very rarely and almost never you find in those narratives appreciation of those individual efforts. So again, a great contrast as to how American dream would look as to what are its goals and methodologies, and how China dream would look at its goals and methodologies. So contrast is what makes it interesting, because they are fundamentally, if you notice now, America is back is the new buzzword under President Joe Biden, and he's trying to reclaim global leadership over a period of time, take all the allies, friends and partners along, etc. So clearly and increasingly obvious over the horizon kind of tussle, shall we say, and I would like to look at the tussle between two dreams. And in case there is a tussle, and obviously they don't have similar aims and objectives, what kind of interaction will happen in those two dreams? Is it that one dream is going to sort of replace the other dream? Is it that they're going to blend together at some stage? Is there going to be transition of leadership? For example, we all have heard about Charles Kindleberger trap, where we know how much of destruction happened when leadership of the world shifted from European powers, primarily United Kingdom, to United States. We had 2 world wars and 1 Great Depression in that period. Now, this time, the aspirant power is not even coming from those Greco-Roman or Anglo-Saxon traditions. It's an Oriental power in that sense, which is an aspirant power. And in case that kind of interaction of two dreams in coming decades, if not next 100 years, let's say next 50 years, which is what China's aim is to become the global leader by 2049. If that transition, forget which ultimately is the dream that the world will come to follow 50 years from here or 40 years from here, but the transition itself, I think, is going to be far more vulnerable and chaotic. And I think that is something where India comes in, is the immediate largest neighbor, where we have to really begin to understand how to handle that transition. And we obviously know that the first meeting of the two leaders is going to happen in Italy in October. The G20 meeting will see some indications of how they meet face to face, just like recently there was a face-to-face meeting between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. So I see that in India, I think it's important to begin to see how that vision of two leaders is going to really deal with each other's vision, and how these two dreams are going to kind of address each other, and whether they are going to find a space to coexist, or are they going to seek replacement of one another. And in case it's a case of a replacement, I think the transition is going to be very, very chaotic. And it is in that sense that India has to carefully look at how to handle that transition, because India believes in maneuvering in the space of multi-alignments, sort of not choosing sides very clearly. But we have seen how lately India is being pushed to choose sides. So that, I think, is an interesting discussion for us to take away as we assess, make an assessment of 100 years of Chinese Communist Party today. What will be that is going to unfold in coming 100 years or coming 50 years is something that should interest us and should help us also prepare to deal with the coming decades from here. Thank you very much. I was happy to be part of this discussion. I look forward to any comments or questions. Back to Dr. Manish.
Thank you, Professor Singh. I think that was again very, I mean, like the early presentations, very precise and concise. So this is really about what you really talked about was the Chinese dream, and ultimately what it was, or what it should be seen as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So CPC and the Chinese nation were really co-joined in that sense, and how the Chinese dream was actually a roadmap to internal and external, I mean, both dimensions, giving a positive spin. And again, very importantly, I think not many understand that there are still different strands of the Chinese dream, different perspectives in different parts of the world of the Chinese dream, and especially India, I think remains, I mean, how India really looks at it remains a very important point of discussion. So thank you, Professor Singh, for this brilliant address. With this, I invite Shri Pramit Pal Chaudhuri, who is with us to give us an American perspective. As you all know, he is the Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times and a distinguished fellow at the Ananta Aspen Center. So, without wasting a single second, I call Pramitji to deliver his address. Over to you, Pramitji.
Thank you. I'm going to talk briefly about how American views of China have evolved, and then give a sense of where I think the present US government's policies are regarding China. The beginning of the modern US involvement with China, or at least communist China, there was first, I would say, a romantic period, laid out most famously by Edgar Snow's book, Red Star over China, which portrayed Mao and the communist leaders who have fought the nationalists during the Chinese Civil War and also fought the Japanese to an extent, as being, in effect, sort of heroic, simple, straightforward peasant leaders who had somehow resisted incredible odds to survive and then eventually take over their country. The flip side of that was a sort of description of the nationalist movement under Chiang Kai-shek as being corrupt and so on. And that lasted, and that helped in many ways legitimize and lay the basis for the bigger geopolitical shift that took place in 1971 with Nixon's visit to China. But in many ways, I would argue that that romantic period, if you wish, as I said, legitimized things, even though Mao was, even during the period before 1971, the Communist Party was extraordinarily brutal, not only in Tibet, but also to its own people, and even how it handled its own internal divisions. And so on. But a lot of that was brushed under the carpet, partly, as it's mentioned, for geopolitical reasons, but partly because of this, I would argue, this Edgar Snow legacy that existed from the past. Through the 80s and the 90s, as China's economic growth developed and it's strengthened, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw a lot of American scholars in the mainstream. This included people like Robert Scalapino in 1993, Richard Baum, 96, Andrew Warden, Tony Seich, Bruce Dickinson, Brookings Cheng Li, even David Schomburg. There's a long list of China specialists in America who laid out several paths that China could follow. Broadly, however, the mainstream, I would argue that while China would remain authoritarian and probably one party, the economic growth and development of the country would eventually lead to a more benign civil society, or more benign party structure and government, more space for civil society, and so on. There were some, but there was another writer, James Mann, who was an American journalist come scholar, who wrote a book called The China Fantasy in 2007. And I cite that because I thought it was an interesting book, because it was considered so out of the pale by almost everybody else in the United States at that point. He argued that you had effectively two schools of thinking in the United States about China. One, he said, was called the soothing scenario, which the one I've described. Authoritarian, maybe a bit democratic, but really ultimately a more open society would develop simply because of the economic pressures of a modern economy. Then there was the upheaval scenario, which he argued was that some people argued that the contradiction between having a modern economy and a one-party state would eventually lead to a collapse of the communist system. Gordon Chang's standard work, which has been repeating now for the past 20, 30 years, was the most famous example of that. He argued, in fact, he says, well, what about a third possibility, a third scenario, which he says that China succeeds economically, but that economic success leads to it becoming even more repressive, even more authoritarian, and the Chinese Communist Party becoming ever more powerful, but showing absolutely no signs of changing or becoming more benign. I met Mann many years later in Delhi, and I asked him, I said, how was that book received? And he said, he said, everybody threw bricks at me. Almost every Chinese scholar in the United States said I was just off my rocker. I had no idea what I was talking about. You're just a journalist, you're a fool, and so on. And nobody paid any attention to that book. I actually still have a copy of that line, yellowed copy sitting there in the back of my shelves, which I dug up some time ago. The irony now, of course, is that the Mann's third scenario is the one that we are presently looking at. A China that continues to succeed economically, but is becoming increasingly repressive, and the Chinese Communist Party becoming, if you wish, not just one party state, but something even more, metamorphosing into something even more unusual or unique. And that comes in the fact that it is merging its autocracy or its totalitarianism with modern technology. And I think this is the important development that really one has to be looking at in China today, is the rise, if you wish, of some people call the techno-surveillance state. That the use of internet, digital technology, and so on, has allowed the Chinese Communist Party to grow economically. In fact, in many ways, move ahead of the West, for example, in the space of things like in the digital side. And then use that to tighten its control over its people with things like the social credit system and so on. And in many ways, I would argue, when the Chinese government now looks at itself and says, we're actually in very good position, a lot of that is based on what it's seeing now. And we're starting to now see, or we have seen now, an increasing amount of literature coming out of the West, and definitely out of the United States in particular, saying, look, the Chinese now have a new model, if you wish, not in terms of just the degree of the monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party, but the means with which it can wield that power and control almost anything within its society, because it will have every full knowledge of what's going on. And I would also argue that's one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party does not see itself as necessarily having to face a Soviet Union type collapse, because that techno-surveillance state gives us the capacity and so on, which on a scale of control and knowledge of its own people that no other society, definitely the Soviet Union, did not have. Fundamentally, that for the Chinese Communist state, it looks at this and say, this is working. And it's one of the reasons now it is now prepared. I am less concerned about the Belt Road Initiative's physical infrastructure than I am about one element of it called the Digital Silk Road, which basically says we will sell this kind of techno-surveillance capacity to dictatorships and other countries around the world who want to use it. We now represent a model of state control that nobody else can handle. And it's actually been interesting in one way too, is that a lot of this technology arose from the private sector. It was the Alibabas, the Tencents, and so on, who developed a lot of the digital economics infrastructure of China. And that was then adopted by the Chinese state, used it for its own political control. And now, interestingly enough, it seems to be turning against that private sector that created it, and said the techno-surveillance state will not allow anybody else to have a similar capacity. Or at least it has to be subservient, fully subservient to the state. So what has that meant as far as the Americans are concerned? If you look at the last 3 administrations, or 4 administrations, we include the Biden administration, you saw and I think Professor Swaran is correct about the American dream, in particular that the American dream is seen as having, if not failed, at least is in crisis in the United States itself. Barack Obama, in his own memoirs, if you look at the subtitle, is called Reclaiming the American Dream, i.e. the American dream is not there anymore. And this reflects an acceptance or recognition within the American system that the enormous inequalities and the decline economically and socially of the white working class now meant that a degree of, should we say, political consensus domestically was now unraveling very rapidly. And this in many ways had been a core strength of the United States, that it could count on a huge chunk of its population, 60 to 70% of its people, to sort of blindly agree to whatever Washington said, because they assumed that the establishment knew what it was doing. The American dream was, that the term itself came from a freelance journalist in 1931, and was developed by a large amount of American literary writers, including people like John Steinbeck and so on, and then later picked up in the popular culture. Obama, I would argue, as well as Trump, who in many ways the rise of Trump represented, was the political consequence of the failure or the unraveling of the American dream, and Biden, all recognize that this problem is there at home. And so therefore the primary overriding American concern is to resurrect some form of that American dream and resurrect an American political consensus about itself and its relationship with the rest of the world. The problem therefore then is, how do you simultaneously do this as well as engage with the rise of a second superpower? And you can see each administration tries a different set of tactics. Obama launches the G2 policy, which is, let's try to come to an understanding with China. Let's work together as partners in solving global problems. And perhaps America can also even concede what was then called the Asia Pacific, that China's dominance in that area, or primacy in the Asia Pacific, is something we would prepare to consider in return for something like that. That policy fell apart. China fundamentally was not interested. And you saw a hardening of American policy by the end of the Obama administration, notably in the creation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and some minor degree of military push. But this entire concept of this pivot to Asia policy in many ways was driven by this. The Trump administration comes in, and more than just the president, but I think really the people who worked with him said, okay, we saw what happened with Obama. We try to do the same thing, i.e. maintain the American dream, but we now do it but engage China in an extremely hardline and confrontational manner. But keep in mind, the fundamental goal of Trump, at least, was to come to an understanding with China as well, particularly on trade issues. But the view was that the way to do it, Obama had offered carrots. For Trump, it was about using sticks. That policy didn't work either. It did make the relationship more difficult to function. He never did get any major concessions from China, partly because of his own incompetence and some of the policies, for example, the use of tariffs, which didn't make sense. So he effectively combined standard military tactics, moving aircraft carriers up and down and so on, starting the process of rebuilding America's missile defense systems in the Indo-Pacific, and in fact accepting the concept of the Indo-Pacific. So you saw that change to some degree, but again, a set of tactics that didn't work. And one of the fundamental problems, of course, was that Trump was extremely unilateral. He did not believe America needed help from anybody to maintain this posture against China and force China to come to the game to some kind of a deal with the United States. So now we come to Biden. So Biden looks back, and his team looks back, and he says, Obama failed, Trump failed. Both of them tried two very different sets of tactics. How do we do this, given that America continues to fall behind and China, if anything, has gotten stronger? And we've now also made a lot of the rest of the world, especially our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, to become extremely wary of dealing with the United States, or question whether the United States is credible. So what do we see with the Biden administration? The Biden administration, I think, sees, one, it accepts that traditional military confrontation is not really viable with China, and that China really is not going down that path anyway. So it's not really about aircraft carriers, which I don't think we'll see America build any more new ones for quite probably forever. your new weapon systems are really going to be in the space of cyber, in drones, and these type of new military structures. Second, that China will seek to undermine you, but try to avoid military power, confrontations because it's not very good at them, and therefore it's going to set down a new work to use its economic power, its technology. Setting global technology standards is now going to be one of the biggest geopolitical battles, whether it's on 5G, artificial intelligence, and so on. So therefore, the fundamental game for America, besides rebuilding itself at home, is to get the technology structures right, continue American and its allies' domination of world technology. Hence the concept of the techno alliances. And you can see whether it's in the Quad, in the G7, and in a number of bilateral, the Biden administration keeps emphasizing the technology part. We need countries like in pharmaceuticals and semiconductors and in telecom. All of these technologies, we need to have alternatives to China at the minimum, and preferably we would prefer to have a situation where we overtake China and maintain a lead, or maintain our present leads in those technology. So technology. This is also going to be crucial in another issue, which is going to be how do you respond to a Chinese model built around techno-surveillance, is that you have to be very good at techno-surveillance yourself, even if it's only to perhaps preserve liberty or freedom at certain elements of that stage. So that's where I would argue we're seeing America today. But we now recognize, or I think America now recognizes, that this is a very different opponent. There is almost no school, including now most of American industry now, that believes that they can actually come to a relationship with the United States. And I'll end by pointing out that if you now look at the literature or the public statements or even official documents being issued by the United States, the language which they use is increasingly hostile. And a simple example is the decision to pass a regulation unbanning TikTok, which looks like a positive sign, though it's actually designed to build a better legal basis for banning TikTok later on. But it refers to China as a foreign adversary. That says if we have to ban such products, such digital intrusions by a foreign adversary like the People's Republic of China, then we have to have a better legal basis for doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramit. I think that was again a brilliant presentation. You really pointed out and discussed in very fair detail the very rich, in fact, texture of debates on the CPC in the US. Obviously, especially since Nixon, met Mao in '71, but obviously looking at different administrations, the Obama, then you have the Trump, and now the Biden. So I think that you really covered a very large ground comprehensively. So thank you for your intervention and your address. We have actually run out of time for the next session, but just to have a sense of participation, we have my colleague Ayushi Ketkar, who is a faculty in the School of International Studies, Center for National Security Studies. So Ayushi, a brief quick question. Please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yeah, please go ahead, Ayushi.
Yes. My question is actually to Shyam Saran sir. I would like his comments on the importance of legitimacy in this entire discussion, especially in the case of superpowers or great powers, as you might say. So with US and China and technology playing such an important role, where do you see legitimacy or the factor of global consensus in this entire game between India and US especially?
So please unmute yourself. Yes, sir, you can unmute now.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I did not quite get the question. Can you just repeat the question, please? Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Am I audible now? Can you
Yes,
hear
Yeah,
me?
you are audible. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sir, I just wanted your comments on the issue of legitimacy. We had very
The
nice
issue of?
legitimacy and global
Okay.
consensus, especially
Yeah.
in the case of USA and China, with these
Yeah.
two major powers trying to pitch themselves as probably a unilateral power or a global power. So what is your view on the issue of legitimacy? And I'm especially asking this in the wake of how US was the first one to actually give the Communist Party of China a kind of legitimacy when Kissinger made that important trip. So, today that seems to be backfiring on them. So I would like your comments in this
Yeah.
way. Thank you.
Well, I think we should perhaps in dealing with history, we should be careful not to fall victim to 2020 hindsight. So what may appear to have been a very important decision taken by the United States in 1971 or 72 to establish relations with China. It certainly had a certain logic and a certain kind of also great benefit for the United States in terms of the international situation that it was confronted with at that particular time. It had two adversaries to deal with, that is both the Soviet Union and China. At a time when it was feeling the pressure from Soviet advances, establishing a alignment with China made eminent sense at that time. So I do not think that because of subsequent events, we should necessarily go back and say, oh, that was a wrong decision. I think we have to look at developments in the context in which they happened. So in the context in which they happened, it made sense at that time. And that is what I would say. With regard to legitimacy, there are two elements in international relations. One is power, the other is legitimacy. Legitimacy is, in a sense, derived from the willing acquiescence or acceptance of the role of a powerful country by the international community or by the community of the nations. Legitimacy is important for a power because legitimacy then allows the economical use of power. That is, if your power is said to be legitimate, if it is even has some moral, kind of a gloss over it, it is not necessary for you to use coercive power in terms of getting others to do what you want them to. So the exercise of power is essentially that how do we make certain that others do what we want them to do or refrain from doing what we want them to do in terms of how we see our interests. So legitimacy allows, as I said, the economical use of power. So when, for example, the United States of America is talking about rule-based international order, that is to try and suggest that there is something which is beyond power, which everybody adheres to, including the United States itself. But the fact is that whenever it has suited the United States, it has not, in fact, observed the rules of that same, international order. Now, I think in those terms, what China is also trying to do is to create a narrative about the use of Chinese power, which allows, as I said, the economical use of power. So, for example, in terms of saying that China will never seek a hegemonism, that China is a country which adheres to not rules-based international order which has been put in place by the United States and Western countries, but to the international order which is centered in the United Nations or the United Nations Charter, thereby suggesting that it in fact adheres to a order which is higher in a sense than what the United States is talking about. I would not underestimate the ability of China to, at least amongst the large constituency of developing countries, to in fact having achieved a degree of legitimacy in terms of its power. So it's not just a nationalist kind of a sentiment, but also a sense that the exercise of Chinese power, whether it is in terms of economic power, whether it is in terms of military power, or in terms of what you mentioned as being a technological power, this role of China is increasingly being accepted by at least the very large constituency of developing countries. And not only that, the economic relationships that China has developed with the United States of America, with Europe, with Japan, these also, in a sense, as long as these countries see an interest in that relationship with China, also grants legitimacy to China, what China's role internationally is. So I think for today, for the United States of America to somehow pose that there is a certain legitimate exercise of power and there is now an illegitimate exercise of power, to some extent it works, like for example on the Xinjiang issue, or maybe sometimes on the Tibet issue, or the South China Sea related issue. But it has not been able to really put China on the back foot. Even in Southeast Asia, as Ambassador Preeti Saran pointed out, that the kind of linkages that China has established with the Southeast Asian countries, it makes it very difficult for the countries in the region to really stand up to China. So in a sense, China has acquired some kind of a veto power over decisions which are to be taken by Southeast Asian countries, whether it relates to security or whether it relates to economics. Maybe the legitimacy is somewhat less than what the United States as the existing superpower enjoys, but I would not say that there is some kind of a weakness on the Chinese side because its exercise of power is not regarded as legitimate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran, and thank you again. I wish we had more time. We have already overshot our time. There are many questions I can see as a host I've received, and even on my cell phone. Unfortunately, we have to end this working session here. So thank you so much, Ambassador Shyam Saran, Ambassador Preeti Saran, Professor Swaran Singh, and Shri Pramit Chaudhuri. I think this was really a brilliant session. Lots of takeaways, lots of reflections by each one of you, which I think added to our and made us better aware of the issues, of the analyses on the CPC. So thank you all again. With this, we move to jump to the next session, next working session. We have with us Ambassador Gautam Bambawale. So thank you, Ambassador Bambawale, for joining us, and you all are aware that he is in fact in that sense very illustrious, has a very illustrious diplomatic career, and very importantly ticking two important boxes: India's ambassador to China and India's High Commissioner to Pakistan. So he is a very prized commodity in these times for all of us, for all the media. So it's great to have you with us, Ambassador Bambawale, and he's joining us from Pune, right, sir?
That's right.
Yeah. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Manish, first, let me say what a pleasure it is to be with all of you today. This particular session, I think you have titled The India Way, and you now want us to talk about how India should be reacting to certain situations around it. And therefore, what I will do is I will focus on what is happening in Eastern Ladakh and focus particularly on what I believe should be India's responses, both in the short term as well as in the long term, to Chinese aggression, Chinese attempted military coercion on our northern borders. So let me just spend a few minutes on this question. The first point that I would like to make is that the the situation, the military standoff that we are seeing in Eastern Ladakh, starting from end April, maybe early May of 2020, and now continuing for a little over a year already. And it looks likely as if it is going to continue for a much longer period of time, is quite different from the military standoffs that we had at Depsang in 2013, at Chumar in 2014, and in Doklam in 2017. And the difference between those standoffs and this current standoff is as follows. In all those previous instances, what happened was that patrols from both sides accidentally came into close proximity with each other, came face to face with each other, and then that created the military standoff. This time round, it's a totally different kettle of fish. The Chinese have moved several divisions of troops. We know that there are 50 to 60,000 troops on the Chinese side and a similar number on our side, which were moved to this location in Eastern Ladakh in end April, early May of 2020, along with heavy weaponry, along with tanks, along with armor. And such a move obviously cannot be accidental. Such a move cannot be something which cannot be planned, predetermined, etc. So this is why the current standoff in Eastern Ladakh is quite different from what we have experienced in the India-China border areas in the previous few years, 2013, 14, and 2017 at Doklam. Now, the big question that we must ask ourselves is that when the Chinese moved these troops, what they were obviously doing was that they were jettisoning. They were saying that we will no longer continue to discuss this problem about boundary, LAC, whatever you want to call it. And there are both involved, as all of you know. But we will no longer continue to negotiate, discuss, talk about this issue. We will try to settle it by the use of force. So this was one of the things which they were indicating by the move that they made about a year ago. Also in the process, they violated many of the agreements, and in fact, all of the agreements between India and China, which were focused on maintaining peace and tranquility in the border areas between our two countries. And all of you know that there are several such agreements, because in most of these agreements, if not all of them, the first paragraph is that neither side will move large numbers of troops to the border areas, to the frontier areas, without intimating the other side. So when the Chinese moved these large numbers of troops to Eastern Ladakh, they were violating all these bilateral agreements between India and China, which were aiming at maintaining peace on our borders. The next question to ask ourselves, of course, is why did the Chinese do this? What were they trying to achieve? What were their objectives? What were their goals? And my answer to that, and I think many others are also saying the same thing, is that you can split this up into two separate parts. One is a tactical reason and one is a more strategic reason. The tactical reason, of course, is that they were trying to move their ground positions right up till what they, in their mind, think is the LAC or the boundary between India and China. So they were moving their ground positions all the way up there. In the process, of course, they were also denying access to the Indian military, to the Indian army, to certain areas, to certain patrolling routes, to certain patrolling points, which our armed forces would normally patrol. So on the tactical side, this is one of the objectives that the Chinese must have had when they moved such large troops to the border in eastern Ladakh. The more important point is the strategic message which China was sending, and the strategic message that China was sending not just to India, but to Asia as a whole and the world at large, was that China is the preeminent power in Asia today, and she can do as she pleases in this part of the world. And others in Asia must accept this, must understand it, and must give this kind of give this kind of acceptance to China as the preeminent power in Asia. So when we moved our military troops, and there's a matching buildup, as you know, our army and our armed forces did wonderfully well. They prevented the Chinese from achieving all of their military objectives, even if they may have achieved some of them. But the military response was magnificent. But we clearly should understand that from a strategic perspective, and even from a short-term perspective, this is not merely a military affair. It is something which also impinges on the huge gap or asymmetry that exists today between India and China. And one way of measuring that asymmetry is to take GDP. And we all know that in GDP terms, India's GDP is roughly $3 trillion, whereas China is roughly 14.5, maybe even $15 trillion. So China is 5 times bigger than India. And this distinction is not something which exists only in economic terms. It also exists in technological terms, in military terms, and beyond that. So there is this huge asymmetry which has built up between India and China. And this was one of the enabling factors. This was one of the necessary conditions which had to be met for China to be able to undertake the kind of military actions she did on the ground in Ladakh in May of last year, and which continues till today. So as far as India is concerned, what we need to do is we need to see how do we tackle this asymmetry between India and China. And in the long term, the answer is quite straightforward. It is staring us in the face. And we do hope that India can gear itself up to meet the long-term challenge that China poses. And that long-term move that India must make is, of course, to build up her economic strength. And along with the economic strength, build up her military strength, her technological strength, and other parts of comprehensive national power. So in the long term, we need to regain this 8 or 9% per annum GDP growth rate and continue that, maintain that for a long period of 20, maybe even 25 years. But that's in the long term. What about in the short term, when this asymmetry continues to exist between India and China? How then do we protect our territorial integrity and national sovereignty in the shorter term over the next few years, 4, 5, 6 years? And the answer to that is that India will need to build balancing coalitions with other countries in the world in order to protect her own territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and in a sense also maintain and protect its own strategic autonomy in the long term from the military coercion which China is bringing to bear on our northern borders. So in the short term, I will argue that we need to build these balancing coalitions. And there are 3 different groups of countries with which we can contemplate building such balancing coalitions. The first group of countries, of course, are the great democracies of the world. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, Australia. And the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Initiative, is one such grouping, one such coalition, which is in the making between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. The second group of countries are those which are in China's periphery. And here I would give example of 2 countries with which India must definitely consider building a coalition. One is Russia, the other is Vietnam. And I accept that in terms of Russia, there are challenges because Sino-Russian relations or China-Russia relations themselves are very deep and very strong. But I think India must not hesitate in building this kind of coalition with Russia and Vietnam as examples. And the third group of countries is, of course, those which are in China, in India's neighborhood, which is the countries around us. And we need to build strong coalitions with them, with countries like Bangladesh, perhaps Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Bhutan. Now, one last point that I'll make, and I'll stop after that, Manish, is that India is not used to doing such things in building coalitions. And this is going to be quite a challenge for India over the next, say, year, 2 years, to build these coalitions with some or many of these countries, which I have just mentioned. So we will need to go out of our comfort zones, because when you build such coalitions, there is always give and take. And what is it that India is willing to give our coalition partners in return for certain things that they are willing to give us? This is going to be a big question. This is going to be a big challenge, not just for Indian diplomacy. It is going to be a big challenge for the Indian nation, for the Indian people, for the Indian society, and the Indian government. And but there is no other alternative. There is no other way. So we need to wake up to this brave new world that we are entered into already, because for the first time in centuries almost, we have a major power or a superpower on our border. I'll stop there, Manish, and hand the floor back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bambawale. I think that was a very clear exposition of what the Ladakh aggression means at the tactical level, at the strategic level. I think that's a very important difference which one needs to understand. And also, very importantly, you signaled at what sort of Indian responses could be in the shorter term, in the longer term. And the last point, I think, which is worth more and more reflecting on, is what are the choices, what are the costs. And India is not used to such maybe transactional sort of relationship. So I think that's a very important point which you made. So thank you again for this very clear, very precise address. With this, I now move to our next speaker, Ambassador P.S. Raghavan. Ambassador Raghavan, as you all know, was India's ambassador to Russia and was also the former chairman of, till very recently, the National Security Advisory Board, which is a sort of fulcrum, a fountain of all the so-called best strategic minds on India's national security. So with this, I now hand over the floor to Ambassador Raghavan. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Manish. Thank you for inviting me to join this session, to join this entire conference, in fact. Now, we've already had actually a very rich, I would say, conceptual and historical sweep of the development of the Chinese Communist Party, intertwined with Chinese ambitions and what it means for us and what it means for the world. I would, of course, my remit is actually in many ways much narrower. You asked me to talk about national security challenges. It is a narrow, conceptually narrow focus, but I think the canvas is wide. Time is short. Fortunately, Ambassador Bambawale has actually covered many of the aspects, because eventually foreign policy and national security policy are actually the same. And many of the foreign policy initiatives that he suggested is really in pursuance of our national security objectives. But let me start by essentially talking about what, in narrow terms, what is the national security challenge from India? Well, it is physical and political encirclement of India by China. Ambassador Bambawale, Gautam talked about the border dispute and how it has been developing. And really, it has been progressively getting worse over the years. And after about a decade of tranquility after 1995, 1996, I mean, we've had Doklam, we've had Arunachal Pradesh becoming a focus. We've had, of course, Ladakh. This is something that is going to remain. And again, as Gautam said, this is not going to go away. On the other side, not that much has been talked about China-Pakistan axis and how really it can impact our security very, very strongly. Of course, we know that from the 1950s, China has been helping Pakistan in its missile development and later in its nuclear weapons development. It has supported Pakistan on Kashmir in every international forum. It has provided the cover for Pakistan's cross-border terrorism in international organizations. We know all that. And we know that all this is China's effort to keep India boxed within the subcontinent so that it does not, that we do not take our rightful place on the global stage. But I think a qualitatively higher level of Chinese engagement in Pakistan is the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And that, actually, we keep talking a lot about our sovereignty being affronted because it goes through Gilgit-Baltistan. But the point is that CPEC, in its ultimate, the ultimate form in which China wants to unroll it, is actually very, very major. It is not only an infrastructure link from Western China to the Arabian Sea. It is not only road, rail, power plants, optical fiber cables, but also it includes various Chinese presence in various Pakistani economic sectors. Of course, eventually the Chinese naval base in Gwadar, an air base prospectively in Karachi. So this is actually an increase of Chinese presence in to our west in a very major way. So you not only now have a threat from China on our northern frontier, we have a potential threat from China to our west and to the Arabian Sea in the west. Now, if you add to that the aggressive presence, and earlier speakers, many of them have spoken about Chinese ambitions and the way in which China has implements its ambitions, its aggressive presence, political, economic, military, in the life of our neighbors, and all acting in such a way as to restrict India's influence on our neighbors. Whether you look at Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Chinese presence there has become very aggressive. And then you get on to the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, much has been talked about it already. The Belt and Road Initiative across Central Asia and now looking to extend to Afghanistan at a time when the ISAF is leaving Afghanistan. The entire objective of the Belt and Road Initiative is to tie in and of course, a larger part of the world, but I'm looking now at Central Asia because Central Asia is of critical importance to us. It is neighbor of our neighbor. Really, it's very close to the Indian border. And what China is doing in Central Asia through the BRI and through actually trying to take over a Russian sphere of influence is very significant for us. And of course, we should not forget that, the arming and training of insurgents in our northeast, which China had actually seized for some time a few decades ago, has now really restarted in very strong measures. So this is another factor that we need to keep in mind. And then you look at the maritime, the so-called Maritime Silk Road, which is a string of ports from Myanmar to Bangladesh to Sri Lanka to Maldives, Pakistan, of course, and to the East African coast. You club that along with the fact of China, which Ambassador Preeti Saran talked about, riding roughshod over all obstacles in its path in the South China Sea. It has settled territorial claims by simply occupying lands which it has claims to, and it has punished countries which it feels in any way has crossed its national interest. Now, if you look back in time, of course, it's not only what it's doing with ASEAN in the South China Sea. It's also how it punished Japan over Diaoyu Islands. It punished Korea for the air defense system that it planned to host on its territory. It punished Mongolia for daring to invite the Dalai Lama, and most recently it punished Australia for seeking an independent investigation into the origins of COVID. So you're talking about a Chinese dominance in the maritime domain, and why is it important for us? not enough is actually said when we talk about the Indo-Pacific and we talk about the importance of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. People don't fully realize how strongly tied up to our political and to our economic and security interest the Indian Ocean is, and even the Pacific Ocean. India is actually a sea-locked country. Because of the nature of our borders to the north and to the west, very little of our goods actually travel across, and very few people travel across those frontiers. So 90% of our trade is on the Indian Ocean, most of our energy supplies included. And by the way, over 30% to 40% of our trade is through the Malacca Straits. This is not often appreciated. So, and so much of the economy of our littoral states are tied up to the Indian Ocean. So many of our security threats, whether it's drug smuggling or people smuggling or arms smuggling, and of course, Mumbai terrorist attack came from there. And in addition, you have the strategic location on the Indian Ocean, and we need to have control over the strategic location. And that is why, this idea of Chinese dominance over the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific is something that strikes at the core of our security interests. And that is why we are striking back with, again, what Gautam talked about the partnership. The asymmetry that exists has to be countered with partnerships in the region. And that is where we have partnership with ASEAN, we have partnership with countries which feel the heat of Chinese dominance and Chinese aggression. With Japan, with ASEAN, and of course Vietnam is very important. And the United States, what we are doing with the United States, of course, we have a broad and very important and deep strategic partnership with the United States, which has many other elements. But in the maritime domain, in the Indo-Pacific domain, their interests, which is, of course, to maintain their dominance in the world, coincide entirely with our interest, which is to try to see that China can be somehow restrained in the exercise of its hegemony. Now, of course, much has been said about the Quad. People talk about it, and in fact, as Russian foreign ministers talked about it as an Asian NATO, etc., etc. It's important to understand what the Quad is and what it is not, and what we are seeking to achieve through the Quad. What we are seeking to achieve is actually bring back China into a cooperative order. This is exactly what Gautam talked about, is to trying to find diplomatic counters to asymmetry in a way that puts pressure on China to come back into a into a cooperative order. Since time is short, I will move from the maritime domain. Now we go, if you look about how to deal with China on the continental domain, because China occupies both our maritime and our continental neighborhood. And there, our convergences with the US are not yet as strong, because the US presence in that region is not as strong. And once the US vacates Afghanistan, it becomes even more important for us to protect our interests in the continental domain through other partnerships. And that is where our Russia partnership comes in, which is where also our participation in Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other such structures, the regional anti-terrorism structure, our foreign secretary mentioned it, gave it great prominence in his lecture on foreign policy yesterday. We need to make sure that we prevent that region from becoming a Russia-China co-dominion. We need to be present there. The Central Asian countries are very keen for our presence there, because they also want to escape, have some space between Russia and China. And that is where the international north-south transport corridor becomes very important, because that is our link to Afghanistan and to Central Asia, because we do not land borders are close to us. So these are all initiatives that we have to pursue in order to make sure that we also keep protect ourselves, secure our interests in the continental domain vis-a-vis China. And that requires, of course, the maintenance of our strategic autonomy. This has also been talked about in the presentations before. So essentially, since time is short, I will say that these are the various aspects that we need to be looking at. The asymmetry is evident. Gautam talked about it. 5 times the GDP, maybe 10 times our foreign exchange reserves, and nuclear weapons, a permanent member of the Security Council. And there is a global clout that they have acquired because of economic strength. Even with India, the huge trade that we have, the major projects that Chinese companies are implementing in India, the investments that they've made. Dr. Kriplani is here from Gateway House. They've done an excellent study on Chinese investments in our unicorns, in our startups, and they are in very key sectors. The kind of influence that they have developed in India. They send us 70% of our pharmaceutical raw material. Smartphones. Every one of us is carrying a Chinese smartphone. The batteries which go into electric vehicles, rare earths, minerals. And COVID has further emphasized this area of asymmetry, which we need. And technology. Again, it has been mentioned before, the kind of ICT reach that China is trying to acquire in the world, including in India. And we have not actually defended ourselves so effectively so far against it. This is again another asymmetry that we need to be working against. China has actually banned international participation in all ICT projects in their country, claiming that they are critical sectors. We have not yet done so. There is no reason why we should not do so. So there are ways of dealing with asymmetry also. And I mean, this is becoming a bit disjointed, but let me also mention TikTok, for example. Data security. Data security is not only protecting personal data and privacy of data. It is also protecting data on mass social tendencies from being stored elsewhere, because that can be used to manipulate social behavior. And that basically, the real significance of TikTok is not because they're taking away your personal data. It is because your social behavior is stored in some data center elsewhere. So we need to be looking at these. The solution, again, Ambassador Bambawale said very clearly, we need to first and foremost build our economic strength, build our military strength, and I would add to that, build our technological strength. There is no need to portray 5G as a struggle between the US and China. We need to be developing our own 5G. 5G is 90% software, and we are the software capital of the world. So we need to take a very focused policy in all these areas. We need to have this combination of internal, external, bilateral, and multilateral initiatives, sustaining a strategic autonomy, and creating for ourselves in the short-term political and economic space to deal with China, and in the long term, create the economic, political, and military strength to go alongside China. Thanks.
Thanks, Ambassador Raghavan. I think that was very comprehensive, as you always have addressed us before I could make out. So very important points. Obviously, I'll just rush through, but I think the last and very important point was about how it was very important that India saw the challenge from China, not just in the maritime domain, but also in the continental domain, and how India should be responding to those challenges emanating from those two theaters, if one can call that. And also how it is so important, your last point, that ultimately India should be focusing on economic and building its own economic and technological capacities, and why we need to focus our attention there and have really sustained long-term interventions to really scale up our power, adding to what Ambassador Gautam Bambawale rightly pointed out. So thanks for that very comprehensive, brilliant address. With this, I now invite Professor Amitabh Mattu, my senior colleague in CIPOD SIS, and also the president of Indian Association of International Studies. He's also a professor at the University of Melbourne, and all are very much aware, the youngest vice chancellor of Jammu University. So great to have you with us, sir, as always. So without further ado, Professor Mattu.
Thank you very much, Manish. It's always a great pleasure to come to events organized by you, and especially in a panel of such distinguished luminaries who have first-hand experience of dealing with China at a policy level. You asked me to focus on Chinese values and why those matter, the whole idea of Chinese exceptionalism, and what should India's response be. I'll focus much more on the Chinese values because I think Chinese exceptionalism is attracting a lot of interest and we need to understand what this is all about. But let me also begin by saying that one of the saddest days of my academic public policy career was in 2018 when I was advisor to the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, a cabinet minister, and we got a sudden directive from the cabinet secretary, Mr. P.K. Sinha. It's all public knowledge. It's not a secret document. It's not confidential. Endorsed by Mr. Vijay Gokhale, who was then Foreign Secretary, and who's just, I think, announced his second book on China this morning, saying that no high-level official contact should be maintained with the Dalai Lama, even as the Tibetans were going to celebrate 50 years of the arrival of the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama in India. And as I said, I think he's a permanent source of benediction for so many of us, including myself. We had agreed to honor the Dalai Lama with an honoris causa degree. I had requested the Central University of Jammu to do that. But at a time when Jammu and Kashmir could exercise its authority with greater flexibility than it can do so now, we decided to go with the event. And we awarded the honorary doctorate to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, despite the, it wasn't a directive, but it was an advisory from the cabinet secretary. I couldn't think of a more short-sighted understanding of His Holiness's role and how much in complete opposition to Chinese values he stands, and how much he reinforces all that's good about Indian values. I'm saying this also because we have two very distinguished ambassadors here who have dealt with China, and I would like to really understand why this kind of tactical navigation is important, even if it's a way of creating the right atmospherics for summits or for ensuring greater cooperation. Of course, as Shyam Saran pointed out, we are always wiser by hindsight, except in this case, we were wiser even then by not following that advisory. However, let me move on and say that the whole idea about China's rise has always invited debate. And traditionally, Manish, you and I know that you've had a realist view of China, and then you have had a liberal institutionalist view of China. The realist view of China believed, as it does today, that China will act exactly like all great powers in the past. Great powers try and rewrite the rules of the game. Great powers expand their empires, and when they're hegemonic, want other countries to submit. You might, British imperialism might be different from Pax Americana, but the British colonialism might be more insidious, or the manner in which it uses its instruments of power might be different. But essentially, British interests, when it was a hegemonic power, as a great power, was expanding British interests. Britain worked for British interests. And China would do the same when China would be a great hegemonic power. That's a simple realist view, historically borne out by how great powers have behaved, and not particularly sensitive to any kind of exceptionalism. The liberal institutionalists, many within our own establishment, presented an alternative, not necessarily derived from Chinese strategic culture, that look, there is a functional alternative to the realist view, which is that you embed China into multilateralism, into multilateral institution, create functional webs so that it has a stakeholding in all status quo in the status quo, broadly speaking. That once you give it a membership of the Security Council, once you give it a membership of the WTO, once you involve it in the Indo-Pacific region, once it has a dialogue partner or bilaterally, you give it the kind of incentives that functionalism, neo-functionalism, or liberal institutionalists believe would then soften its harder edges, soften the kind of realist view of the world. Unfortunately, the promise of China being socialized, as they said, into accepting the rules of the game have not worked out. China has not been socialized to the extent that it thinks that a rules-based international system, which is essentially a rules-based international system made by the Americans, suits its interests anymore. It will slowly, incrementally, and sometimes dramatically try and change those rules of the game. In other words, we have then the realist view. And however, sinologists have always suggested that even when you take a realist view of China, it's important to understand Chinese culture, Chinese strategic culture, because that makes China exceptional even as a great power, quite apart from the fact that there might be a certain degree of similarity between all great powers, but there's a certain special quality to China and Chinese, the manner in which Chinese handle power. Much of this, in my view, had also come from the work of the great historian, medical scientist, Joseph Needham. And I always recommend to all those who are interested in China and who start reading contemporary literature or newspaper readings, that go back to Needham. Needham was this person who actually went to China to study science and civilization in China and produced 7 outstanding volumes on China, and then asked a simple question, which is that why did China and India, which before the 16th century, before Galileo transformed Europe, and you had the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution following that, why did China and India, which had basic knowledge and science, knowledge of science much greater than Europe and the Western civilization, then not keep that promise? And the Needham question, or the Needham dilemma, or the Needham paradox, is something that has invited numerous questions. From the most simplistic question that the Chinese script imposed certain limitations, that even though China knew about gunpowder and printing and more about fundamental laws of physics, they could not exponentially build on that knowledge. Has to do with all sorts of explanations that have been offered since then. And I will give you my final explanation. But as I said, the Needham question is something which often bothers people. And Needham, of course, raised that question more anecdotally about India. About the Chinese values, there are 3 competing paradigms, as we know. One is the Confucian paradigm, which is the one which the Chinese would like everyone to believe. The Confucian-Mencian paradigm, which is basically a sense that the Chinese privilege harmony. They look for hexy, or harmony, in every sphere of life, and they want complementarity, yin and yang, and all the kind of reification of harmony and accommodation which the Chinese have articulated and keep articulating in forums, and which most sinologists seem to swallow without due criticism. And this, of course, is also derived from, this also has the whole idea of Panchsheel is also derived from this whole sense that Confucius talked about how it's important for all gentlemen to believe in hexy and harmony, and that has to be the guiding principle in life. Now, and that harmony doesn't mean uniformity. Harmony means just a sense of mutual respect, and that big countries should respect small countries and vice versa, and that it's always lonely at the top, that once you become a great power, you have to be conscious of the fact that you can't see the world around you in the same fashion, so you have to be extra sensitive to taking a 360 view of the world. this is, for me, this is all hogwash. But I'm not a sinologist, so maybe there are sinologists, however, who will defend this paradigm much more effectively than the Chinese Communist Party. But then there was, of course, an alternative view put up by people like Lester Ian Johnston, that in contrast to this benign, accommodationist, harmony-driven Chinese Confucian paradigm, you have had a much more offensive Chinese strategic culture. And Ian Johnston studied the 7 military classics. Some people argue that this is a very selective reading of the 7 military classics. But he talked about the fundamental importance that the Chinese give to Xi'an, the concept of flexibility and sensitivity to changing relative capabilities, and a preference to a parabellum strategic culture, which always privileges violence and conflict and offensive strategies, depending on your relative capabilities. Together, of course, is the third thing, which is the Maoist philosophy, which sees conflict as zero-sum, which sees conflict as in class terms, which recognizes the importance of the party as being the instrument which keeps the nation united and knit together. So through all these three different paradigms, if you synthesize this, for me, there are 5 different features which are almost diametrically opposite to what India and Indians stand for. One, of course, the whole idea that territorial integrity is sacrosanct in a very Westphalian way, but also extremely sensitive. People keep talking about how China has done border deals with all its neighbors except India. Examine those deals. I can answer questions on those deals. That for them, a Westphalian hardened notion of sovereignty defines their culture. Secondly, as I said, a Senbian, a parabellum strategic culture which is extremely sensitive to relative capabilities. It won't take on the strong, but the moment you're weak, China prefers a violent, aggressive means of settling conflict. The final 2 are that Chinese strategic culture, and I use the word, it's an offensive word to use, is almost cannibalistic. It is ready to devour its own in the pursuit of what it sees as the larger interest. Cannibalism is often defended by some as when you don't have anything to eat, then it's justified to eat the most nutritious, and that's your own. So Chinese strategic culture is not Confucianism. It's not even parabellum strategic culture. It's becoming more and more cannibalistic, particularly because eventually, and our geopolitical fronts like Krishnendra may be able to point this out, that there is a sense also of Lebensraum, living space, that you will have to territorially expand to accommodate the Han population, the growing Han population, especially now that they have done away with the one-child policy. However, to answer the Needham question, which is why did China not achieve the glory of the West? Why did China suddenly succumb? It's because precisely the reason. Because China reified the state, did not allow intellectual freedoms, did not allow the robustness of rich ideas, which is essential for the growth of innovation, technology, and its export for the diffusion of ideas. Therefore, I think even today, while you might think that China is going to rule the world, it's not a question of when, but how will China rule the world, as Martin Jack pointed in his book argued. I think it's premature to believe that China will rule the world, because ultimately Chinese history or strategic culture and the values imbued in Chinese history are such that ultimately it will be a prisoner of its own contradictions and even collapse in its own contradictions. Then the richness of India is not to mimic China, but to present itself as it has over the last 75 years as a completely and diametrically opposite model to China in terms of our values, in terms of our core strengths, and in terms of the freedoms that we allow our individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mattu. I think very important, obviously, point you made about the role of values and how, in fact, making a very strong plea, which I think many would agree that India should remain what it is in its last 25, 75 years or even earlier. So, very important. And I think rather than looking at through a unifocal lens, you beautifully pointed out how, in fact, one could see three competing strands, competing paradigms in terms of the Chinese values and Confucian flexibility, strategic culture, and obviously Maoism, which really talked about a which really is about a zero-sum game. So again, thank you so much for really enlightening us with this brilliant exposition. With this, I invite. Ms. Manjeet Kriplani, who is with us. Manjeet ji is the co-founder and the executive editor of Gateway House based in Mumbai. She is, in fact, an award-winning journalist, multiple awards, was the India Bureau Chief of the Business Week magazine, one of the very top magazines from 96 to 2009. So great to have you with us, ma'am, from my home state, Maharashtra. So I'm equally excited to have you with us. So without any further ado, over to you.
Thank you. My predecessors have spoken so well that it's going to be hard for me to be as creative, given that they've really laid everything out so nicely. But we have a little bit of overlap, and I'm going to bring it up in the context of China and business. So, and show how the CPC runs commerce. In June 2018, our institution led a group of Indian businessmen. Gautam will remember this. We led a small group of Indian businessmen and entrepreneurs on a trip to China to understand the wonder of its sort of gleaming new virtual economy and its startups. So our first stop was at NIO, which is the Chinese version of Tesla. And it was fantastic. You know, gleaming showrooms, gleaming cars, gleaming office, gleaming young executives. The chief strategist gave us a presentation and showed off NIO's latest technology, which was released the day before. So if you owned a NIO car and you weren't home, you could order your groceries or books to be delivered to your NIO, wherever it was parked. An app on your phone would alert you about the delivery to your parking spot, which was the boot of the NIO, which would open and your parcel would be deposited. So whenever you were ready and you drove your car home, your parcel was with you. And of course, we were wonderstruck, all this cutting edge delivery in 2018. And before Tesla, they said they innovated this before Tesla had come out with it. Well, a week later, when we were back in India, we checked, and Tesla had announced plans for the exact kind of same service for its California market a week before NIO announced that it had innovated this new service. Of course, it hadn't. NIO just copied Tesla and was selling the service before it was practically implemented. It never did, because obviously the technology wasn't NIO's. Instead of which now Tesla has gone to China. It is investing $5 billion for a factory near Shanghai to cater to the world's second largest market for electric cars outside the US. So this is business China style, or rather CPC style. You copy it, you reverse engineer, you steal the patent, and you sell in China and globally. The bonus is what is called the China price, which is 20 to 30% cheaper than anywhere else in the world, because land, water, electricity are all subsidized by the state. It's been a great model, very successful model. It's brought the world to its feet, and China is the global commercial champion. So today, the Chinese Communist Party turns 100, and there's a lot to admire and much to celebrate, especially in the business world. Jack Ma is as great as Bill Gates and Narendra Modi, and Alibaba is the world's largest e-commerce player. NIO is called the Tesla of China. The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China is not only China's biggest bank, but the world's largest bank in terms of assets. China runs a market economy, but with Chinese characteristics, where the state has a stake in everything, and a Chinese Communist Party worker has an executive position in every company. The CPC is a guardian of everything and the thief of commerce. How did China get to the top business spot in the world? 3 ways. First, it had the right guardian angels. Of course, it was Mr. Nixon who prized open the doors to China, and the United States, which championed bringing China into the WTO starting in 1986 The Japanese finished that job, okay, of this difficult process. The UK experts wrote China's new and up-to-date laws to enable it to trade with the world, and Asia became China's contiguous market, and the rest of the advanced world that invested in China, ensuring this success. The second is the pragmatism of the Chinese Communist Party, which made a communist country the second greatest capitalist in the world. The big change came mid-century at the age of 55 in 1976 when Mao died and Deng Xiaoping turned China around, understanding that they had to concede to some principles to make China a commercial giant and pull itself out of poverty. So as you know, they had the market reforms and they made it really easy for investors to invest because the CPC enabled everything. And the third reason is innovation through theft. At least half of China's business is from multinationals. These are tightly controlled joint ventures overseen by the CPC. With these companies now embedded in China for the last 4 decades, the leak of intellectual property is routine. Analysts predict that in 1918, the US alone lost about 320 billion in IPR theft to China and 80% of the cost of its IPR that year. But the multinationals can't resist the lure of that big market. It's growing competitive domestically. Chinese multinationals and national champions on the rise. Even during the pandemic, FDI into mainland China grew by approximately 18% month on month in 2020. So with the return on investments on their Chinese investments at 20% more than the global average, these companies aren't going anywhere, and losing some IPR is written into their risk. And this is going to stay this way until shareholder welfare trumps shareholder profit. Had it not been for its ill effects and COVID-19, the world would have continued to admire China, and we would have all continued with the case of acute China envy and its ways of doing business with its theft, overloaded MPAs, continued capital flight, coercion and corruption in a closed economy. These would have all been the stuff of accepted case studies. So what can India learn from this, and what can we do? 2 very early and immediate steps. First, this is the time when the world is more amenable to alternate investments opportunities, and India must also now find a guardian angel, just like China did. So the Quad countries are good candidates to be these guardian angels, especially the US, as the world starts to decouple from China, at least the US does. India is more developed than China was at that time, but it needs specific help as it readies to move into a modern regulatory system. The US can offer technical assistance, particularly on regulation and institution building, which also will have to also actively build on peer-to-peer relations with Indian government officials down the line. We'll have to expand our reach into, the partnership will have to expand its reach into academia and think tanks and deepen engagement with semi-autonomous public-private agencies that will be the bedrock of the bilateral. Secondly, India can build on its current cutting-edge strength, its digital depth. We used it well after China, against China after Galwan exactly a year ago. In an act of asymmetric war, India banned over 200 Chinese apps. Ambassador Raghavan mentioned this. This was so effective that it toppled the IPO of TikTok in the New York Stock Exchange last year. We basically blew a $150 billion hole in their sky because 40% of TikTok's market was India, with its diverse people and cultures, which gave the algorithms, and as the ambassador said, it stores our social behavior. India must build on this strength. The rise of India's digital market is mirroring China's, with 2 welcome exceptions. Foreign investment in India is deepening, and India is not implementing a China-style surveillance state. Rather, the country is building up a virtuous network of mostly open source and volunteer-led low-cost platforms in partnership with the government, which have benefits for the developing and developed world. So seeking global digital partnerships with fellow democracies will certainly provide some alternates to the Chinese commercial coercion. Thank you.
That was brilliant, Ms. Kripalani, and I think what we wanted to know, and which you really told us fantastically, that how really the CPC in fact runs business, and what is that CPC model, and again obviously we all are surely aware that it is about stealing, it is about reverse engineering, but again very important that despite all this, I mean, it is really pragmatism that drives the CPC and its interest and its business interest, and that's a very important point which one needs to understand. And again, concluding on talking about what steps India can take, I think those are very important, I think, pointers which the decision makers in the government should be also reflecting more on, is about these whole alliances with US, with Quad. To what extent and how can India really benefit out of this strategic moment in its competition with China, and also the still very important Indian domestic market. I think these are very important points which you have made. So thank you again for those brilliant remarks, and we have just enough time to get in one question, only one. So Aditya is with us. Aditya, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Yes, Aditya, you can unmute now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Aditya Kumar Singh, and I'm currently pursuing my master's in international relations from SIS. I have a small question for Ambassador Bambawale. Sir, we have been discussing about the ASEAN's centrality in the Indo-Pacific region. So given the discomfort among the ASEAN nations, is it still relevant vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific or Quad?
Yeah, that's a good question, Aditya, and thank you very much for it. It's a question which a lot of people are asking today. In my view, I think the writing is on the wall, as all four of the speakers in this session have clearly pointed out, that the rise of China is also making it, a power, a traditional great power, which is also, as Professor Mattu said, cannibalistic. Now, in this kind of scenario, I think, what the ASEAN countries are doing is that they're saying that they want to sit on the fence. They don't want to choose between, say, the US on the one hand and China on the other. And in fact, the choice is very stark. It is between a democratic vision for the Indo-Pacific and an autocratic vision for the Indo-Pacific. And I think, it is very clear, my recommendation is very clear, that India needs to build on the Quad, needs to move further on the Quad with or without the ASEANs. So I think this, some time ago, to be very frank, India also was sitting on the fence. But today, especially after what's happened in Eastern Ladakh, I don't think we are anymore. I think the way is very clear as far as we are concerned. I hope the ASEANs also realize this and make a decision on this autocratic versus a democratic vision for the Indo-Pacific sooner rather than later. I hope I've answered your question, Aditya.
Thanks, Ambassador Bambawale. I think that was again a very precise response. So as promised to myself and to all the participants, we are calling it a day, and it's just about 1:30. So thank you all, and I now invite Prafulit to give a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Prafulit. Please. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of Team Indian Futures, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers, Shri MADHAV, Member, Board of Governors, India Foundation, Ambassador Saran, India's former Foreign Secretary and Senior Fellow at CPR, Ambassador Preeti Saran, former Secretary, MEA, Professor Swaran Singh, President, Association of Asia Scholars and Chairperson of CIPOD JNU, Shri Pramit Chaudhuri ji, Foreign Editor, Hindustan Times, Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, former Chairman, National Security Advisory Board and India's former Ambassador to Russia, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, India's former Ambassador to China and Pakistan, Professor Amitabh Mattu, President, Indian Association for International Studies and Professor at CPOD SIS JNU, Manjeet Kripalani ji, Executive Director and former and co-founder of Gateway House. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our participants who joined us through Zoom and many others who were with us through YouTube and Facebook. I would also like to thank all the participants who joined us from across the country and abroad. Please follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube to get timely notifications for future events, seminars, and workshops. Thank you all. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you and bye-bye.